In 1838, Chester County had more than 3,200 inmates. Oh, no, not that kind of inmate. Inmate is one of those antiquated words we come across all the time in historical research, and it's really important we know the meaning of that term in order to understand the original source. The use of the term inmate first appeared in Chester County in 1720 and continued through 1900. And for most of that period, it simply meant a married or widowed man, older than 21, with no taxable real property like land or buildings. Historically speaking, all men who were 21 or older and lived in Pennsylvania paid some form of a tax. If someone had property, well, then they simply paid a property tax. If a man older than 21 didn't possess any taxable property, well, they still had to pay a head tax. So you can already begin to see how tax records can be a real goldmine for genealogists. The government is really good at collecting taxes, and if your ancestor held property or was a man older than 21, well, then they will likely be documented in the tax records. Now, these unique specifications create a few different categories of taxable persons, so let's break them down. First, there was the standard landholder. Notice I didn't say landowner, because the tax collector charged the person physically seated on the property, whether they owned the property or simply rented it from someone else. If anyone held land in their possession and utilized it, they would have paid a tax on the property as the landholder. Here's an example. In 1837, Sarah Passmore owned a small plot of land in East Marlborough Township, so she paid $1.09 in county property tax. A year later, in February 1838, Passmore sold the plot to Ezekiel Bailey. In that year's tax assessment, Passmore's name was retroactively crossed out because she was no longer the landholder. Rather, the new owner, Ezekiel Bailey, became responsible for the $1.31 county tax as the new landholder. Similarly, we know through deed research that Ezekiel Hoops owned about 100 acres of land in Westtown Township in 1778, but you will not find his name in the 1778 tax assessment. Why is that? Well, even though he was the owner, he likely leased the property out to someone else. Therefore, Hoops was not the landholder. His tenant was the landholder, and therefore his tenant was responsible for the property tax. Sometimes you can distinguish the tenants from the owners by looking for a land tax explicitly written under an individual's name. Again, even if a person leased the property, they would have been the ones taxed as the landholder because they were the ones physically seated on and utilizing the property. But it was common practice for the owners to reimburse their tenants for the annual land tax. Therefore, the assessors would explicitly write out the tenant's land tax so their land was defined separately from the rest of their property. If we want to know who might have been leasing this 100-acre property from Ezekiel Hoops in 1778, well, then we can look for the name of an individual being taxed in Westtown for 100 acres in that year's assessment. In the 1778 Westtown tax assessment, we see 7 individuals with the amount of their land tax under their name, implying they were all leasing their properties. 4 of them, John Glenn, Richard Thornbury, Isaac Hoops, and Isaiah Hoops, leased 100 acres, the same size of Ezekiel Hoops's property, so we might assume one of these 4 men was his tenant. Furthermore, in some years, especially in the 19th century, if a landholder leased the property as opposed to owning it outright, the name of the landowner will appear alongside of theirs in the column. Now, Mary Norris owned about 500 acres of land in Westtown in 1778. Through a bit of genealogical exploration, we know Norris resided in Philadelphia, so she was not physically seated on this property. Yet her property was assessed and valued at £11 under her name. Why? Well, this likely implies no one was physically seated on the property. and Norris would have been taxed as a non-resident landholder. Taxing unceded land like this was intended to motivate the owner to either lease or sell the property to someone who would improve and would develop the land. Mary Norris was living in Philadelphia. Why would she care about this huge plot of 500 acres out in Chester County? Well, she should care because she was being taxed for it. It was basically the government's way of discouraging real estate investors from buying huge tracts of land and leaving them unimproved. All of these individuals, Sarah Passmore, Ezekiel Bailey, and Mary Norris, were classified as landholders, even though some owned the property while others leased. The second category of taxable person was the landless individuals, and there are two subcategories here, the inmate and the freeman. Like we mentioned at the start of the video, if someone was categorized as an inmate, we know they held no taxable real property, they were at least 21 years old because again they had to pay a head tax, and were married or widowed. Inmates were the head of their own household, but typically resided in a small cottage on someone else's larger estate. Other regions refer to these individuals simply as cottagers. There would have been some type of work agreement between the inmate and the landholder. The inmate typically would have been an artisan, farmer, or laborer who worked for the landholder in exchange for a set wage as well as room and board. The inmate did not own or lease the land. Rather, they simply worked for a landholder who, in return, provided a dwelling place. The 1797 Goshen Township returns are really unique because they list the inmates along with who they lived with. The inmate could use their free time to accept side jobs for extra money, but their main responsibility was their work contract with the landholder. The freeman, on the other hand, also owned no taxable property, was at least 21 years old, but the distinction was the freeman was single. It's interesting to compare the tax rates of these two groups. You'll notice in most years, the single men paid a higher rate compared to their married counterparts, meaning there was a financial incentive to get married. These taxable categories, landholders, inmates, and freemen, remained consistent through the mid-19th century. Around the 1870s, inmates and single freemen were grouped together under one category and were no longer charged separate tax rates. This grouping makes it a bit inconvenient for genealogists because it's no longer immediately clear whether the person was married or single. The terminology changes in the early 20th century with the adoption of two simplified categories, owners and tenants. Starting in 1904, the names in the owner category were the actual owners, while the names in the tenants category leased the property. In order to maximize the utility of historic tax records, understanding these categories is critical. When you hear that in 1838, Chester County had 3,200 inmates, that can either be really shocking or quite mundane depending on how you interpret that term inmate. 3,200 prison inmates is really shocking, but entirely false. 3,200 married or widowed men, older than 21 with no taxable property is a bit less sensational but more accurate.